Welcome to the video for Chapter 3 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to tell you all you need to know about Sanskrit verbs. The point of this chapter is to introduce you to a variety of concepts all relating to Sanskrit verbs. And in order to illustrate these concepts, we will need individual Sanskrit examples. But the main point of the chapter is for you to understand the concepts, not to memorize the examples. So don't worry if you can't remember individual forms, you don't have to. We say that Sanskrit verbs are marked for, i.e. have visible features expressing several grammatical categories or categories of grammatical information, and these categories are called person, number, tense, voice, mood. And what we're going to be doing now is go through each of these categories and see what exactly they mean. First of all comes the category of person. Here we distinguish between first, second and third person, and in English, just as in Sanskrit, the first person talks about the speaker, so I, or if there are several of us, we. The second person talks about the addressee, the person who's being talked to, you go, you see, you are, and so on. And the third person talks about someone else, so he, she, it, or in the plural, they. So for example, she goes, they see, and so on. Next up is the category of number. Now, number, of course, is an everyday English word, but here we're using number as a technical grammatical term. And there are three numbers that we need to know for Sanskrit, and these are singular, dual, and plural. So the singular expresses that exactly one person is doing something. So for example, in English, I go, it goes, she goes, and so on. The dual would talk about exactly two people doing something. For example, both of you go, both of us see, both of them run, and so on. And the plural would talk about more than two. So for example, we go, they all go, you see, and so on. Note that there is a difference between Sanskrit and English here. English only has two numbers, namely singular and plural would be used for whenever you've got more than one, i.e. 2, 3, 4, and so on. But Sanskrit has a separate number for exactly two people doing something. Next up is tense. Tense is how verbs express time. There's three levels of time. There's the present, there's the past, and there's the future. In English, that would be, for example, present, I go, past, I went, future, I will go. Now, Sanskrit has one way of referring to the present and one way of referring to the future, and then there's three different ways of referring to the past that we'll have to get to know. Next, there is mood, and again, mood is here used as a grammatical term, not in the sense of being moody or something like that. And Sanskrit has three moods, the indicative, the potential, and the imperative. The indicative is used for statements, such as English, I go. The potential is used for any kind of potential or possibility. So, for example, English, I could go, I should go, I might go, I would go, and so on. And finally, the imperative, which is used to express commands. So, for example, go. Another everyday English word that's here used as a technical grammatical term is voice. And the Sanskrit verb is marked for three different voices, namely active, middle, and passive. Active and passive are basically like their English counterparts. The active refers to someone doing something, whereas the passive refers to someone having something done to them. So an active example in English would be I see or I speak. Passive examples in English would be I am seen or I am spoken to. The middle doesn't exist in English, and it's called the middle because once its meaning was in the middle of active and passive. Once, the middle expressed the idea of I do for myself, or I act in a way that affects myself. This would have been in the middle of active and passive in the sense that if I act in a way that affects myself, then I am the one who acts, but I'm also the one who is acted on. So, for example, a middle might have expressed I wash myself, where I am the one who washes and also the one who is being washed. It might express something like I feel, where I is the one who's doing the feeling, but I am also the one affected by the feelings. It might express ideas such as I run, where again I'm the one doing the running and also experiencing the running. That was once. Now the middle still exists as a separate set of forms, but it is not separate from active or passive in its meaning anymore. Fortunately, we won't have to worry about the details of any of this until chapter 21. So those just now were the 5 categories that the Sanskrit verb is marked for: person, number, tense, voice, and mood. Now we need to look at how these categories are marked, how these categories are expressed. You may have noticed that Sanskrit and English verbs express very much the same kind of information. In English, just as in Sanskrit, you have a first, second, and a third person. In English, just as in Sanskrit, you can refer to the present, to the past, to the future. The main difference between how English and Sanskrit verbs work is how they mark this information. In English, you mark this information, you express these categories by adding little individual, little independent extra words in front of the verb, whereas in Sanskrit, what you do is you add endings directly to the right-hand side of the verb. So not individual words, but things that are actually glued onto the verb forms. So for example, in English, if I want to say you carry, then I add a little extra word, you, in front of the verb carry. If I want to not talk about you, but talk about them, then I change that little word and I say they carry. In Sanskrit, I would express these ideas by adding different endings to the same verb, and so you carry would be bharasi, whereas they carry would be bharanti. Si, nti correspond to you, they. Similarly, if I want to express a different tense, then in English I will do that by adding another little word in front of my verb. So not they carry right now, but they will carry at some point in the future. In Sanskrit, again, I do not use an independent little word that I add in front of my verb, but rather I use something that I stick onto my verb form, or rather in this case I stick it into my verb form in front of the ending expressing they. Bharanti is they carry, bharishyanti is they will carry. At this point, I'm afraid we need to get even more technical and talk about 3 different things to do with verbs, which are verbal roots, verbal stems, and verb classes. Now, first of all, the verbal root is the minimal form of a verb. It does not actually occur on its own in any kind of text. It's a theoretical construct, but we need to know because all other forms of the verb are based on this root. When you memorize a Sanskrit verb, you basically do that in reference to the verbal root. So just as in English you would memorize a verb as to do, to be, or something like that, in Sanskrit, instead of to do, you would memorize the root form of the verb. A verbal root is customarily indicated by means of a root symbol that you also know from mathematics. And so, for example, pat would mean to fall or to fly, gam would mean to go. Pat and gam are examples of Sanskrit root forms, and they are marked as such by means of the root symbol. Coming up next are verbal stems, which are the forms of a verb to which endings are added in order to form a complete verbal form. For example, the present stem of the root pat, to fall or to fly, is pata. Notice that there is a hyphen at the end, which tells us that this is not a complete form. You can complete this form by adding endings to it. So, for example, on the basis of the stem pata, you can then get patasi, which means you fall, patanti, they fall, and so on. Another example of a verbal stem would be the future stem, again of the root pat, indicated with a root symbol. Again, pat means to fall or to fly. We have the future stem patishya, which consists of pat plus this future marker ishya. Again, this is a stem, not a complete form. You can tell that by the fact that patishya ends in a hyphen. And if we want to form complete verb forms on the basis of this stem, then again we need to add verbal endings. So, for example, patishya si, which means you will fall, or patishyanti, which means they will fall. Now we just saw the verbal root pat, meaning to fall or to fly, and its present tense stem pata. In Sanskrit, different verbs add different things to the root in order to form their present tense stem. All verbs that add the same thing to the root in order to form their present tense stem are seen as belonging to the same verb class, and there is a total of 10 verb classes, so 10 different ways of getting from a verbal root to a present tense stem. To give you just 2 examples of this, what is considered class 4 is any verbal root that adds ya to the root in order to form the present tense stem. So, for example, the root hrish, which means to be excited or to be happy, has a present tense stem hrish ya. The root nrit, meaning to dance, has a present tense stem nritya. Class 6 roots, on the other hand, do not add ya. Instead, they add a to the root in order to form the present tense stem. And so from the root wish, we get a present tense stem wisha. From the root lik, we get a present tense stem lika, and so on. Unfortunately, the verbal technicalities don't end here. We also need to know the difference between affixes and endings. Now, affixes are literally added on things, and we distinguish 3 different kinds of affixes. There are prefixes, infixes, and suffixes. Prefixes are anything that is added in front of a verbal root. Infixes are anything that is added into a verbal root, and suffixes are anything that is added behind a verbal root. The root plus all the relevant affixes together make up the verbal stem. Endings are then what we call anything that is added at the end of a stem to make a complete verb form. So, for example, if you want to form the future stem, you need to take the verbal root, lik. You need to add the future suffix, ishya. Note it's a suffix because it's added behind the verbal root. And then you add the ending si, which gives you a complete verb form, likishya si, you will write. Lik is the verbal stem. Sorry, lik is the verbal root. Likishya would be the verbal stem, in this case the future stem. Likishya si would then be the complete verb form, meaning you will write. One final technical note concerns punctuation marks. Sanskrit actually has only one punctuation mark, namely the danda, or literally stick, which marks the end of a sentence. There are no commas, and the danda can mark the end of any kind of sentence, so it can stand instead of a full stop, a question mark, or also an exclamation mark. It can be doubled, and if it is doubled, it indicates the end not of a sentence, but of a complete paragraph. Once you start reading texts in verse, you will see the single and double danda used slightly differently, because in verse, single and double danda respectively indicate the halfway point and the end point of a metrical unit. This may sound very abstract right now, but you'll see how it works as soon as you see your first original text in verse. That was a whole lot of new material. If you are confused or if you feel overwhelmed at this point, that is entirely understandable. It's not you, it is the material, which is tricky. However, you will see many examples of stems, roots, endings, affixes, infixes, suffixes, and so on from now on. These concepts will become familiar, and what you should do until they are familiar is simply come back to this chapter for reference whenever you need it.